Simon says, stand on one foot. Simon says, close your eyes. Simon says a total prohibition on firearm ownership would likely have a minimal effect on gun violence in Canada. Wait, no, actually, Grok said that last one. Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be diving back into some firearm-related crime statistics to show once again who was right on the matter. Are we gun owners correct to say that gun crime is merely a symptom of violent crime? Or are the gun control types correct to say that guns cause gun violence?
This is an issue that touches every single community, and there is a very strong correlation in the explosion of the handgun universe and the increase in handgun crime.
Well, the Liberal government in Canada has long claimed that gun violence is caused by firearms. That firearm ownership itself somehow displays an extremely high correlation to not just the rise that we see in firearm-related violent crime, but to some extent to the rest of violent crime as a whole. And that the best way to reduce violent crime, particularly firearm-related violent crime, is to reduce the overall numbers of firearms lawfully owned in Canada, because that, in turn, will reduce the crime rates and/or firearm-related crime rates.
The member opposite himself brought up what they did under the Harper government in those years. What they did was loosen gun control laws. What they did was make it easier for people to buy assault-style weapons, and that led to direct increases in gun ownership and, unfortunately, in violent crime across the country.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
A moment ago, I listed 4 stabbing deaths that have happened in the last 3 days, including a police officer. And the Prime Minister glibly got up and said, well, he's going to ban hunting rifles. Stabbings happen with knives, not hunting rifles.
Now, I've done a number of videos in the past debunking the nonsense claim that there's any kind of correlation between increased firearm ownership and increased violent crime. But today, I'm going to attempt to do it in a more mathematical and empirical fashion. And to do that, I'm going to need some help. Enter Grok. Now, for those who may not know, Grok is X's AI chatbot, which is available to anyone with a premium account on X. Now, among the various AIs out there, it's one of the younger ones, and it may not be as advanced as others, such as ChatGPT, but it is plenty capable for our purposes here today. And I'm not using it for any particular reason over the other AIs, I just happen to have access to Grok since I'm verified on X. So what are we going to do with Grok here? Well, as it so happens, there are actually a number of ways to mathematically calculate correlation. So when the Liberals say that there is a correlation between firearms ownership and violent crime, that can actually be calculated and expressed mathematically if you have the right information.
Gun violence is a complex problem, but at the end of the day, the math is really quite simple. The fewer the guns in our communities, the safer everyone will be.
But despite what Trudeau would have you believe, the math is not exactly simple on this. So I asked Grok for some help with it. And more interestingly, Grok also went above and beyond and began interpreting and explaining the results of this correlative analysis after it did the calculations for me. So the math itself was pretty useful, but these explanations are also what I think is pretty cool here. For our purposes here today, we are using Pearson Correlation coefficients. That is the most appropriate formula to be using for this kind of a relationship. Now, Pearson Correlation measures the linear relationship between 2 variables. We compare any 2 variables to see if they're correlated in some fashion, meaning that when one variable changes, the other variable changes alongside it in a proportionate way. For example, the Liberals always say that guns cause gun violence, so that's 2 variables that we can measure and compare. Gun ownership is one variable, and gun violence is another. And then we'll also be comparing other variables and other topics to see how much they are or aren't correlated to one another. Now, you don't need to understand much about the math to really know what's going on here. All you really need to know is how to understand the results. Correlation coefficients are measured in results between 1 and -1. In our example, a 1 would be an absolute perfect positive correlation, meaning that as gun ownership goes up, violent crime goes up. And you might use a result like this to say that guns make society less safe. Now, a -1 would mean a perfect negative correlation, meaning that as gun ownership goes up, violent crime comes down. And you might use a result like this to say that firearm ownership actually makes society safer. And then a 0 would mean that there is absolutely no correlation between the 2 variables, meaning that they move independently of one another. So you might use a result like that to say that firearm ownership is completely unrelated to firearm crime. And I'll color code these results to you to make them easier to understand as we go. So anywhere in the blue area represents the stereotypical conservative viewpoint, and anywhere in the red area represents the more stereotypical liberal argument, and then the green area would represent an idealized outcome where guns become safer as ownership increases. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, because my first questions to Grok were not about the liberals' hypothesis, but rather about our own hypothesis. Our hypothesis being that gun crime is a symptom of overall violent crime, and that the best way to reduce gun crime is to implement measures which will punish criminals for their violent behavior. We also claim that going after law-abiding gun owners will not affect crime for this reason, but we can get into that more when we engage the liberals' hypothesis. For the bulk of our conversation, I'm using this Jurastat article from Statistics Canada. It was released in early 2024 and pertains to firearm-related crime between 2009 and 2022. I've used this article in the past on the channel, and it's a government source for the raw data that we need to calculate our correlation coefficients. So my first real questions to Grok were a bit hit and miss. Like, this was my first significant interaction with AI of any kind, and as such I think I may have expected a bit too much from it. Like, I basically straight up asked Grok in a single question to gather all of the information on its own, format it, organize it, calculate it, and then let me know what it got. Turns out it wasn't able to do that all in one go. So I had to help it along. What I wanted was for Grok to calculate the correlation between violent crime and firearm-related violent crime using this information in Data Table 1 from the Jurastat article. Now Grok couldn't find it, and I uploaded a picture of the table for Grok to look at, and surprisingly, Grok came awfully close to understanding and reading the information perfectly off of the table. However, there were a few errors in there, so I had to input the information manually, which actually happened in pretty much every instance throughout our investigation. But after that, Grok happily did a grueling amount of mathification and spat out this number for us, 0.705. Grok gave us its opinion on this result, saying this: as the rate of firearm-related violent crime increases, the total violent crime incidents tend to increase as well, with a linear relationship that is fairly consistent but not perfect. So how good of a result is this? Well, remember, 1 would mean that they are completely correlated, 0 would mean that there is no correlation, and a -1 would mean a negative relationship. So a 0.7 lands us here on that scale. Not too bad. But we can do better, because we don't just have to measure the entire time bracket at once. We can have our little mathling here do our bidding and break this down into other time periods. So what does the same information look like if we break it down by governance? What does the correlation look like when the Conservatives were in power, and since the Liberals have been in power? So I had Grok mathify a few more answers, and here is what it found. It found a 0.775 relationship between 2009 and 2015, as well as a walloping 0.942 between 2016 and 2022. What this means is that since the Liberals have been in power, there has been an almost perfect correlation between overall violent crime and firearm-related violent crime. Now, I thought that alone was pretty telling, but I decided to look a bit harder at the numbers here. Because what was most curious to me was the fact that both correlations went up by a fair amount, meaning that there could be some anomaly in the data or in the time periods. So I asked Grok a number of questions where I adjusted the time periods or eliminated certain years, trying to suss out where the anomalous data point was. And then I found it. If you break the time periods down before and after 2013, you get two almost perfect correlations. 0.945 before 2013 and 0.929 after 2013. So what this means, or what this could mean, is that something changed in 2014 which had a significant influence on the relationship between overall violent crime and firearm-related violent crime. And this is something I noticed as well over a year ago in my video questioning the constitutionality of the handgun freeze. If we take a look at this graph from the 2022 Jurastat article, the nearly perfect linear relation between gun crime and overall violent crime is pretty self-evident. The two lines follow each other almost perfectly. Now, there is an anomaly in 2014 and 2015 where the proportionality changed slightly for some unknown reason. That's a reason unknown both to myself and to Jurastat as far as I can tell. But before and after this time period, there is almost a perfect correlation on the graph between gun crime and violent crime. Now, a full year later, I still don't know what the cause of this is. Like, there weren't any firearm policy changes in 2014 which could account for this, or even 2013. But not everything has to be policy related either. For example, 2014 marked the beginning of the fentanyl crisis in the States, but in Canada, it was only still starting to build up steam. Now, that could have led to increased cartel and gang activity in Canada as they began setting up their criminal infrastructure, and that could be the change in the proportionality that we're seeing. Or it could be any number of other things. But if we want to make a dent in firearm-related violent crime in a way which goes beyond a simple just lock them up ethos, which in and of itself is not a bad suggestion, then that might also be a question worth asking. So what changed in 2014?
That, detective, is the right question.
So, depending on how you want to break up the information, there's either a strong or nearly perfect correlation between overall violent crime and firearm-related crime. But it's worth remembering, and it's worth saying over and over, correlation is not causation. This does not necessarily prove anything one way or the other. However, it's a strong indication that we might be on the right path here. Now, time for the big calculation. Do more guns mean more gun crime? Well, we can't exactly say for sure because we don't know how many firearms there are in Canada, and we can't know how many firearms there are since non-restricted firearms aren't registered. Any numbers you could find online for this information goes beyond highly speculative, and it wouldn't be useful in calculating a correlation coefficient. However, there is a subset that we can calculate with reasonable accuracy. Handguns. All handguns are registered as either restricted or prohibited firearms, and on top of that, handguns also serve as a fair predictor of all firearm-related violent crime since they account for such a large proportion of it. In 2022, over half of all firearm-related violent crimes were carried out with handguns, and those numbers climbed as high as 70 to 80% in some cities. Now, the true percentage is even higher when you consider that the statistic includes things which are not actually firearms. And in case you find yourself asking why the government is including things which are not actually firearms in their firearm crime statistics,
That, detective, is the right question.
So the number of handguns is a knowable number, and the number of handgun crimes is a finitely reported number. Now, I call the number of handguns a knowable number because it's not discretely reported anywhere. A number of you recommended I file an ATIP to get that number, and I did end up trying that, but I ran into some technical difficulties so I wasn't able to get them. However, I was able to calculate them with, I think, pretty reasonable accuracy based on inferences to the publicly available registration certificate numbers found in the various reports from the Commissioner of Firearms. So these are the numbers that I got, and they match up very closely to the national handgun import numbers from TheGunBlog.ca. It is worth noting that the import numbers are about 10 to 15,000 higher than the actual handgun numbers per year, with a little bit of variance, but that's also because the import numbers include things like law enforcement and military imports, which aren't going to be counted in the individual registration certificates or for the business registration certificates. Now, I'll explain exactly how I inferred these numbers in the pinned comment down below, with links to the data and to the graphs which support them, so you can judge my methodology for yourself to see if it's valid. I did also ask Grok if it could find out the number of handguns owned in Canada, but it was busy eating crayons or something, I don't know. Like, I asked it to find or figure out these numbers for me, and it simply couldn't. Like, it couldn't even get past the fact that registration certificates and handguns aren't the same thing. So the heavy lifting was once again up to me on the back end. Thanks, Grok. But you know, Grok also had its moments. So I gave Grok all of this handgun information for it to do some more correlation calculations for me, but I made a small mistake. Do you see it? Because Grok did. In 2011, I fat-fingered a button and there was one too many digits in there. Now obviously that's a typo. And to my surprise, Grok thought that was obviously a typo too. And Grok attempted to correct it, despite the fact that I was telling it point blank to accept these numbers as fact. Now that demonstrates, to me at least, some legitimate level of understanding. It was able to comprehend that I can make a mistake and that such a number was otherwise wildly out of place in this dataset. Of course, it had no idea what I was actually wanting, and it made the wrong correction to that number, but it was still interesting to see Grok pick up on that mistake I made nonetheless. Anyways, moving on. So I gave Grok the proper dataset this time around and asked it to calculate the correlation coefficient between lawful handgun ownership and handgun crime. Now remember, the gun control types want a 1 here, we want a 0 here, and a -1 would suggest that firearm ownership makes society safer. Which, given Canada's hyper-restrictive gun laws, there'd be no way for that to actually play out in practice. Now, I also opted out of calculating the year 2022 because the Liberals brought in their handgun freeze in the middle of 2022. So any information that might have had to support that policy could not have possibly been from any year later than 2021. And the result of all of that is an astounding correlation of 0.01. Now that's about as close to zero as one could reasonably expect, indicating that there is absolutely no correlation between lawful handgun ownership and handgun-related violent crime. Grok had this to say. The value is very close to zero, suggesting no meaningful linear relationship between the two variables over this period. And it also said, this weak correlation aligns with the evidence that most crime guns in Canada are illegally sourced, for example, smuggled from the US, and not from lawful gun owners. I then asked Grok to run the calculations again to see if there was any significance in particular time brackets, just as we did before. And you wouldn't believe it, but the correlation actually got lower. As low as 0.0000. That's zero. That's all the way zero, meaning absolutely no correlation of any kind. Now, Grok also rightly points out that the data is possibly flawed, being that these handgun ownership numbers are simply my extrapolations. To which I gotta say, that kind of hurts, buddy. What the heck? I thought we were friends, Grok. But in case you're thinking the same thing, we can use some more reliable numbers, namely those handgun import numbers from TheGunBlog.ca. And we broke it down into all of the time brackets, and these numbers were slightly better for the Liberals in a few of the time brackets, but still close, very close to zero, not even a 0.1 to speak of, which also wouldn't be that remarkable anyway, even if it got that high. Now, I'll be honest, I'm kind of surprised at those numbers. Not necessarily at the big picture numbers, because we see about a 91% increase in handgun ownership with only a 1.9% increase in handgun-related crime. But when we break it down specifically into certain time brackets, that's where things are kind of weird. Because ultimately, since 2014, both handgun ownership and handgun crime have both increased. So I was kind of expecting a more damning result closer to something like a 0.2 or maybe a 0.3. That in itself wouldn't necessarily be that bad, but at least you could maybe suggest that they're slightly related. So what we're likely seeing here is the result of the two variables not following each other closely enough to imply any kind of covariance, even though they both happen to increase. Because a basic watered-down explanation of what the Pearson Correlation calculation attempts to do is to figure out a ratio between the two variables every year, and then to compare those ratios to the ratios of other years using some kind of standard deviation. And the resulting coefficient is the representation of how much covariance there was in comparing those two ratios. Now, as you can see with the meaningless examples on screen, even in the datasets with a couple of extreme outliers, it can hurt the resulting coefficient to a noteworthy extent, but it also doesn't completely torpedo it. So what this means is that most years have to be unrelated to most other years to produce near zero results, like we're seeing with the relationship between handguns and handgun crimes. Like a couple of outliers isn't going to tank the whole thing. Now, if you're a critic, you might be inclined to say that at the end of the day, they're both going up, so what does it matter if they're not going up by the same amounts at the same time? Well, it matters because this indicates that they're going up independently of one another. This means they're not related to each other. Statistically speaking, it's just a coincidence. Now, you might not like that answer, especially if you're the gun control type, but you also need to remember that even though there are areas on the graph where it definitely shows that handgun ownership and handgun crime are going up at the same time, there are other equally important areas on this graph where it shows them trending in opposite directions. Such a result would not be possible if it were true that guns cause gun violence. Now, if you're a smart critic, you might have another complaint. Thus far, all we've really looked at is the relationship in individual years. But suppose you bought a handgun in 2012 and then it was later stolen, and in 2015 it was used in a crime. The 2012 handgun would now show up as a problem in 2015 rather than just in the year that it was purchased. Correlating individual years doesn't catch a problem like that. But there is another formula that we can use to find these lagged effects if they exist. And it's called the Granger causality formula, and we can ask a question like, does handgun ownership Granger cause handgun crime? And asking Grok this question tells Grok to check the handgun ownership numbers against the future crime numbers to see if handgun ownership can predict handgun-related violent crime at some point down the road. So again, we check our 5 time brackets, and Grok states rather definitively that there is no evidence to support these time-delayed claims either. Although ever the devil's advocate, Grok does point out various limitations with the analysis, particularly the smaller sample sizes and especially in the shorter time brackets. Like, we shouldn't really expect Granger causality to work well in those time brackets because it only has a few years to check against the past and future events against. But there is something here which kept bugging me. Where is Grok getting the idea that most of the firearms used in crime come from illegal sources such as smuggling? Like, there was no such indication in the 2022 Jurastat article, even though there definitely should have been, and the fact that it wasn't even mentioned kind of points to a pretty heavy bias from Jurastat when you think about it. Well, Grok got this idea of smuggling from other online sources, but at the same time, it also picked up on a lot of other mainstream narratives like the idea that guns cause gun violence or that firearm ownership is somehow responsible or correlated with firearm crime. Because earlier on, I had asked it a couple of leading questions which were sort of trick questions to find out if Grok would have a tendency to just agree with whatever I suggested, or if it would actually correct me when I'm out of line. And these questions led to Grok often going to the internet for various argumentative sources. Now, fortunately for us, it did correct me, and it did not fall for my trap of leading questions, which was very important, because my final questions were in the important ones, and I wanted to ensure that the nature of my questions wouldn't influence Grok's answers. And it was also a good thing that Grok picked up on these gun control arguments so that it could provide the alternate perspectives when necessary. And my final questions to Grok were pretty straightforward, and they were based on the Liberal government's assertions towards gun violence. These are their hypotheses, not mine, and to make sure that we absolutely get this right, we are going to use their own very exact words. So question 1. Given what we know about our correlation coefficients, is it fair to say
The fewer the guns in our communities, the safer everyone will be?
Now, Grok responded with this. Based on our correlation coefficients and analyses, it's not fair to presume that the fewer the guns in our society, the safer everyone will be as a blanket statement. The weak link to legal ownership and the dominance of illegal guns suggest limited impact, and broader safety hinges on factors beyond gun numbers. So imagine that. Grok says that Trudeau is wrong, and that we need to be focusing more on illegal firearms and addressing the root causes of violent crime. Now it's Mendicino's turn. Question 2. Given what we know about our correlation coefficients, is it fair to say
there is a very strong correlation in the explosion of the handgun universe and the increase in handgun crime?
Well, the answer to this one should be fairly obvious by now. Like, we've demonstrated very clearly that there is no statistical correlation between handgun ownership and handgun crime, and Grok agrees with that assessment, stating this, saying extremely high correlation would be a gross misrepresentation of our 0.0117 correlation. A fair statement based on our data would be there is an extremely weak correlation between lawful handgun ownership and handgun-related violent crime in Canada from 2009 to 2021. Sick burn, dude. And lastly, the big question we've all been waiting for. Question 3. Given what we know about our correlation coefficients, is it fair to presume that prohibiting firearm ownership will reduce firearm-related crime or overall violent crime in a significant or substantial way? And Grok said, based on our data, it's not fair to presume that prohibiting firearm ownership will significantly or substantially reduce firearm-related or overall violent crime in Canada. The evidence suggests a weak link to legal ownership and broader factors dominate. And this is where Grok also said a total prohibition on firearm ownership would likely have a minimal effect on gun violence in Canada. And as damning as all that is for the liberal gun control ideology, those last words are really the more important issue here. Broader factors dominate. What Grok is saying here is that we really can't tell whether or not firearm ownership plays any role in violent crime or firearm-related violent crime, or if our subset of handgun ownership plays any role in crime, because there are just too many other confounding variables which are masking its presence, if there is any. And like earlier on when we asked Grok about the relationship between overall crime and firearm-related violent crime, Grok responded by saying that they likely have, because they're so highly correlated, they likely have the same underlying contributing factors. And this is where we get to the important disclaimer of the video, because I'll say it again, correlation is not causation. But more than that, you should also take everything in this video with a grain of salt. Now, first off, as much as I tried to be as accurate as I could in this video, there are some problems with the data in it. Really only one problem. The biggest of this issues is the handgun numbers. Those are guesstimations. Now, I think they're pretty accurate guesstimations based on everything we can see, but they're still not perfect. And the Pearson correlation formula is pretty strict. Like, they can tolerate a bit of noise and some statistical outliers without too dramatic of a cut to the coefficient, but it can be picky about the data points if they're not reasonably close. And then the second of these disclaimers is, as I always say, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm also not a statistician. There are multiple different correlation formulas, all with their own different strengths and weaknesses. And which one you use is sort of based on the kind of data you're interpreting, but also it's sort of based on your own judgment. The Pearson correlation is apparently the most common, but it's also one of the more strict formulas. For example, there's another one called the Spearman's rank formula, and it doesn't focus on the individual values and ratios of the respective variables, but instead, it rank orders them and does a correlation based on that. So it sorts the data from highest to lowest, where the year with the highest amount of firearm ownership gets put in first place, and then the second place goes to the next highest, and then third place goes to the next highest year, and so on. And then it checks to see if the corresponding crime for those years is also listed in the same order. It doesn't care how much either value has changed, only that they're going in the same direction at the same time. And this obviously makes it a much more generous standard. So if we ask Grok to Spearman rank the relationship between firearm-related violent crime and overall violent crime, you actually end up getting a very similar coefficient as to what we got from the Pearson Correlation. So this is 0.676 versus our original 0.705. However, if you ask Grok to Spearman rank the relationship between handgun ownership and handgun crime, we don't get anywhere near a zero result like we did with the Pearson calculations. We actually get a pretty high correlation of 0.681. However, being that the Spearman rank is so generous, it's also not nearly as useful or insightful. Like, all the Spearman rank calculation is doing is noticing that both variables happen to be going up at the same time. And therefore, it's kind of much more prone to finding coincidences. Pearson correlations are much more useful in this sense. Like, for example, it's well known that most of the firearms used in crime come from illegal sources, and most of those are not domestically sourced. If we are feeling particularly generous, we can assume that 80% of our handguns are not domestically sourced and that 20% are. Then we can ask Grok to recalculate our handgun coefficients based on handgun crimes having only 20% of their original value. And that would basically represent the 20% that our handguns are to blame for, essentially. Now, and funnily enough, when I asked Grok to do this, it guessed that I was asking it to filter out crime guns even though I said nothing of the sort. So that was kind of amusing in and of itself. Now, once again, Grok showed some understanding of what was actually going on here. Anyway, when we check the Spearman rank correlation after we factor out these criminally smuggled firearms, the correlation doesn't actually change at all because all of the handgun crime values remain in exactly the same order from highest to lowest. And because that ranked order doesn't change, the correlation doesn't change either for this formula. However, when we check the Pearson correlation to factor out these crime guns, the resulting correlation actually goes up to 0.083, up from 0.0117. So there are some pretty basic limitations with the Spearman rank formula, which make it incapable of really telling us anything useful about the gun control conversation. But as you can see with the Pearson correlation formula, even if we do a lazy attempt to control for the smuggled firearms factor, what Grok has been calling a confounding variable, the correlation actually improves a little bit. So I'm sure if we went down the list and controlled for socioeconomic issues and policy issues, drug issues, mental health issues, gang issues, catch and release problems, and a dozen of other things, you could probably excavate everything else away and end up with a nugget of truth with a near perfect correlation between lawful gun ownership and firearm-related violent crime. However, once you do that, the remaining firearm-related crime numbers would be absurdly small. And this is kind of what Grok meant when it said that broader factors dominate. However, even without controlling for these confounding variables, our analysis of the correlation between overall violent crime and firearm-related violent crime still produced an extremely high correlative result. So it's not like these controls are exactly required. If we're on the right path of a significant predictor, those results will show up regardless of whether or not we control for these confounding variables. Like, to put this into perspective, the government is basically attempting to reach in and pluck out the proverbial needle from the haystack here. And I mean, you can do it. There is definitely a needle in there somewhere, but you'd have to be delusional to think that removing this needle would affect the size of the haystack that you still have left to deal with. And not only that, but it's well known that this needle is much less dangerous and much less prone to committing crimes than the rest of the proverbial haystack. So, being that I'm not a statistician, it might be that using the Pearson formula is not truly the fairest formula here. It might be that it's just too strict to produce a fair interpretation of the results. However, that strictness is what makes it the most useful in my opinion, and the most likely to produce meaningful results. And on top of that, the Liberals are promising linearity with their rhetoric. They are insisting that reducing firearm ownership will directly reduce firearm crime. That is a linear claim. One directly affects the other, and our graphs show no exponential growth in either firearm ownership or crime, or any kind of arbitrary thresholds which could break that linearity. However, like I say, our handgun numbers are probably pretty close to being accurate, but they're not perfectly accurate. And having these perfectly accurate counts might change the resulting correlation. Like I said earlier, kind of maybe like a 0.3 or something, which itself is genuinely not that significant. But even if it does end up being higher, these results are mostly indicative of recent years. The way that violent crime was recorded by StatsCan changed in 2009, which is why most modern Jurastat articles don't reference before that time period. But that being said, the way that homicides are recorded is something that hasn't changed. And if we use that as a proxy, firearm-related homicides have more or less been steadily declining since the 70s, with the exception of the last 10 years. And in all of that time, lawful ownership has only been going up. Lawful ownership of firearms has only been going up. Even if you can produce some damning correlations in the recently selected years, that's just not representative of the overall trend that we've been seeing for decades. Any positive correlation that you might be able to produce with our recent decade could be equally defeated by an overwhelmingly negative correlation that we've been seeing since the 70s. Plus, these correlations also presume that any reduction in firearm crime would not face a substitution of other criminal methods. For example, banning firearms to reduce firearm crime would be fairly pointless if it's just going to lead to more knife crime. If it means taking a piece off of the chessboard, then you could certainly argue that it's a help, but if you're just trading a knight for a bishop, you're really not making any progress. And I gotta say it again, but the purpose of this video is not to suggest that correlation is causation. And according to Grok, a lack of correlation also doesn't mean a lack of causation. It isn't made to prove some kind of final definitive victory on the gun control conversation. The point of this video is to show that correlation is a fairly flimsy and easy to prove statistic, and to remind people that correlation is the sole claim of the Liberals' gun control ideology. But even among that sole claim that they insist is true, they just don't have a leg to stand on. I'm going to put a link to the conversation with Grok down below if you want to read it for yourself, and you can also use this link to continue the conversation and to ask Grok questions based on what has already been discussed, in the case that you think I'm asking an important question or whatever, but fair warning, you will probably need a Premium X account to do that. Also, I ran into a number of technical issues while making this video with my A-tips, as well as with some of the Jurastat crime tables, and some of the questions that I asked Grok I was unable to share for some reason. I don't know if the conversation was just getting too long or what the deal was, but after a while I couldn't save and share the conversation anymore, so some of the talking points that I showed in this video are just screenshots of other conversations that I couldn't end up sharing. But I imagine if you ask Grok these same questions, you'll get very similar answers. Also, Grok had far more to say than just the snippets that I showed in this video, and some of these things were even mildly pro-gun things. For example, at one point it suggested that maybe we should just ban all guns to stop gun violence, both the lawful and the unlawful ones, which is both funny and pretty dumb. The unlawful ones are already banned, but to be fair to Grok, the internet was probably influencing his answer there a little bit. I also didn't instruct him to consider any rights or freedoms of affected gun owners, so it was kind of stating that in a one-dimensional vacuum, much like the gun control types do. But if you think I was misrepresenting the stats or Grok answers or anything like that, most of the conversation is down there for you to inspect for yourself. But whatever the case, the Liberals have also finally admitted that this is not about public safety. In a recently leaked audio file, Public Safety Minister Gary Anandasangari openly and blatantly confirmed that none of this is about public safety, and that it's aimed directly at procuring votes, specifically from the Quebec electorate. Not only can we prove that there is no meaningful statistical correlation between lawful firearm ownership and gun crime, but also that the Liberal government has always known this to be true. Both the statistics and the politicians confirm this. Yet despite all of that, the definitely not voluntary confiscation program is slated to roll out at least a pilot project in Cape Breton later today. So it seems that no amount of reasoning can stop them from persecuting us for votes, because they have known all along just how baseless this plan really is. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.